She had 48 hours before she stopped being a person and became a debt repaid. Her father didn't look at her when he said it. He kept his eyes on the card table, on the empty whiskey glass, on anything that wasn't his daughter's face. Alara Whitlock stood in the doorway of the Frost Creek Saloon and heard her future sold for $32 and a man's gambling pride. 19 years old, flowers still on her hands, and not a single soul in that crowded room looked up. Drop a comment right now. Tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button, stay until the very end, because what happens next on that mountain will change everything you think you know about survival, strength, and what it really means to be free. The bread always burned when her father came home drunk. Not because Alara forgot it, not because she lost track of time or let her mind wander. The bread burned because the moment she heard his boots on the porch steps, that particular heavy, uneven rhythm she had memorized before she was old enough to understand why she needed to memorize it, her hands stopped working right. Her fingers would tighten around whatever she was holding. Her body would go very still the way a rabbit goes still in tall grass. And somewhere between the oven and the door, she would simply lose the thread of what she'd been doing. It happened again on the third Tuesday of October, 1883. She smelled the smoke before she remembered the loaves. By the time she pulled them from the oven, the bottoms were black. 3 loaves. Almost half a day's worth of flour they couldn't afford to waste. Alara set them on this cooling rack anyway, scraped the worst of the char with a knife, and told herself that the inside was still good. She had gotten very skilled over the years at finding what was still good inside things that looked ruined on the outside. The front door hit the wall hard enough to rattle the window glass. "Smells like you burned something again." Her father, Thomas Whitlock, filled the door frame the way a storm fills a valley, all at once, with no warning, taking up more space than seemed possible. He was not a large man by frontier standards. He was average in height, a little soft around the middle from years of tasting his own product without the physical labor to balance it. But he had a way of making himself feel enormous. Alara had never been able to explain it to anyone. It was in the way he held his shoulders, maybe, or the way his eyes moved around a room like he was calculating something. "It's fine," she said, keeping her voice flat. "The inside is good." "The inside." He crossed the room and picked up one of the loaves, turned it over, looked at the black bottom. Then he dropped it back on the rack like it offended him. "Can't sell burnt bread, Alara." "I know." "If you know, then why does it keep happening?" She didn't answer. She had learned a long time ago that answering that particular kind of question never led anywhere useful. Frost Creek was the kind of town that existed because it had to, not because anyone had planned it that way. It had grown up around a mining camp in the late 1860s, back when the silver rush had people believing the mountains would make them all rich. Most of the silver was gone now. The miners who hadn't died or moved on had become something else: shopkeepers, ranchers, drifters. The town had inherited their exhaustion. 2 streets wide, maybe 6 blocks long, with a church that needed a new roof and a jail that got more use than the church. Population somewhere around 300, depending on the season and how many people had given up and left. The Whitlock Bakery occupied a narrow building on the east end of Main Street, wedged between a hardware store and a building that had changed purposes so many times nobody bothered to track it anymore. Thomas Whitlock had opened the bakery 15 years ago, when Alara's mother was still alive and the idea of settling down had seemed like something other than a slow defeat. In those early years, the bakery had been decent. Not prosperous, not thriving, but decent. That was before Thomas discovered that he was better at losing money than making it. The debts had started small. A loan here, a missed payment there. By the time Alara was 12 and old enough to understand numbers, the bakery was already operating on borrowed time and borrowed money. By the time she was 16, she was the one doing most of the baking, most of the selling, most of the bookkeeping, and most of the explaining to creditors who showed up with hard faces and harder voices. She was 19 now, and the math had finally gotten impossible to ignore. "How much did you lose?" she asked. Her father had moved to the back room, where he kept a bottle that he thought she didn't know about. She heard him pouring. "None of your business." "It is my business. I run the books." A pause. Then the sound of him setting the glass down. $40, he said. Alara put both hands flat on the work table and looked at the grain of the wood. $40. They owed the flour supplier $22 already. The rent on the building was due in 2 weeks. She had been hoping, stupidly, she understood now, that November might be a good month. People bought more bread in cold weather. She had been counting on that. "Who to?" she asked. Another pause. Longer this time. "Harlan Cole." She turned around. Her father was standing in the doorway of the back room with his glass, and he was doing the thing he did when he knew he'd gone too far, keeping his eyes somewhere around her chin, not quite meeting her gaze, like looking directly at her would make the conversation more real than he wanted it to be. Harlan Cole owned the Silver Spur Saloon, which occupied the largest and most profitable building on Main Street. He was not from Frost Creek originally. Nobody seemed to know exactly where he was from, and nobody asked because Harlan Cole was the kind of man whose past felt better left unexamined. He was in his late 40s, always dressed well, and operated his saloon with the kind of smooth, controlled efficiency that made people slightly uncomfortable without being able to say exactly why. He had a smile that reached all the right places on his face and still somehow felt like a door closing. "Papa." Alara heard the flatness in her own voice and didn't try to change it. "Why were you gambling with Harlan Cole?" "He runs a card game on Tuesdays. People play. People who can afford to lose, they play." She moved toward him slightly, then stopped. Not from fear, or not just from fear. From the understanding that moving closer never helped. "How are you planning to pay him back?" Thomas Whitlock finally looked at his daughter, and something in the way he looked at her made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She didn't sleep that night. She lay on her narrow cot in the room above the bakery, listening to the wind come down off the mountains, and she ran numbers in her head until the numbers stopped making sense, and she was just lying there in the dark, feeling the specific weight of a future that had already been decided without her. She had been doing this, calculating, planning, trying to find the angle that made the problem solvable, for so long that it had become a kind of reflex. The bakery was her problem. The debts were her problem. Her father's drinking was her problem. She had been treating all of it as problems to be managed, corners to be cut, deficits to be made up somewhere down the line. But $40 to Harlan Cole was not a problem to be managed. It was a different kind of thing entirely. She got up before sunrise, as she always did, and started the day's bread. The sourdough starter, which she had been nursing along for 3 years, which had survived 2 hard winters and 1 summer so dry the flour had gone strange, sat on the shelf where she always kept it, bubbling quietly in its crock. She fed it and set it aside and began mixing the morning's first batch by feel, in the dark, her hands knowing what to do without any instruction from her brain. Martha Greer came in at 7:30 to buy her usual 2 loaves. Martha was in her 60s, had been coming to the Whitlock bakery since before Alara's mother died, and had the kind of direct manner that Alara had always appreciated. "You look terrible," Martha said, which was her version of "Are you all right?" "Didn't sleep well." "Your father come in late again?" "He's always come in late." Martha counted out her coins on the counter. She always paid exactly, always in small denominations, as if she'd been portioning the money out all week. "I heard he was at Cole's place last night." Alara wrapped the bread without looking up. "People talk. People see." Martha picked up her loaves and tucked them under her arm, then quieter. "You be careful, girl. Harlan Cole doesn't let debts go." "I know. I mean it specifically." Martha's voice dropped further, something careful in it. "I've heard things about how he collects when the debt is from a man with a daughter." Alara's hands went still on the paper wrapping. "Thank you, Mrs. Greer," she said. Her voice came out even, which surprised her. After Martha left, Alara stood at the counter for a long moment with her hands flat on the wood, the same posture she'd had the night before. And she thought about what she knew about Harlan Cole. She thought about the way he'd looked at her the 2 times she'd been inside the Silver Spur, once delivering a cake order, once helping a drunk regular find his hat. She thought about the smile that reached all the right places on his face and still felt like something closing. She thought, 48 hours. It was a guess, but it felt like an accurate one. She saw Gideon Hale for the first time that afternoon. She was restocking this front display, moving the older loaves to the front, filling in the gaps from the morning's sales, when she heard a horse outside that didn't sound like any of the horses she recognized. Frost Creek was small enough that she had unconsciously cataloged the sounds of most of the regular horses. The heavy clop of Jensen's draft team, the quick nervous step of Doc Pierce's mare, the particular rhythmic forebeat of the Callaway Ranch horses. This one was different, slower, a big animal that moved deliberately, conserving effort. She looked out the window. The man on the horse was hard to miss, though he didn't seem to be trying to attract attention. He was tall. She could see that even mounted, with the kind of build that came from physical work over years, not from vanity. Wide shoulders, heavy forearms. He wore a canvas coat that had been repaired in at least 2 places she could see, and he rode with the easy posture of someone who had spent enough time on horseback that it no longer required any conscious thought. His face was partially obscured by the brim of a hat that had seen better years, and his jaw carried several days of dark beard. He stopped his horse in front of the mercantile and dismounted. He looped the reins over the post with one hand and pulled something from behind the saddle, a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, and carried it inside. He didn't look at her window. He didn't look at much of anything except where he was going. She went back to the display shelf and told herself she had no idea why she had noticed him at all. He came into the bakery 20 minutes later. The bell above the door announced him. She was at the counter, writing in the ledger, and she looked up with the expression she used for customers, not quite a smile, functional and professional, and found herself looking up farther than usual. Standing still, he was bigger than she'd realized from the window, not in an aggressive way, just solid, the way a good piece of furniture is solid, obviously capable of holding weight without any drama about it. "Afternoon," he said. "Afternoon." She set down her pen. "What can I get for you?" He studied the display for a moment. His eyes moved methodically, left to right, like he was reading something. "What's the sourdough?" "That's mine. My starter. 3 years old." She paused. "It's 30 cents a loaf." He looked at the loaf, he looked at the price card. He looked back at the loaf with the expression of a man running a calculation. "I'll take 2. She wrapped them. He put coins on the counter, exact, she noticed, like Martha Greer, and picked up the bread. He was almost at the door when she found herself saying, "You're not from here." It wasn't really a question. She didn't know why she said it. She was not, generally, a person who said things without knowing why. He stopped, turned his head just slightly. "No." "Passing through?" A pause. Not evasive, more like he was deciding whether the question was worth the words it would take to answer. "Maybe. Need to resupply. Pick up some things." "There's a decent mercantile," she offered. "And Henderson does repairs if your tack needs work." Saw the mercantile. He turned a little more. His eyes settled on her face with a directness that was not unkind but was completely without the social cushioning that most people applied to their looking. Not the way men in saloons looked at women, just direct, like he was noting information. "The bread's for the trail, heading back up Thursday." "Up the mountain?" "Got a place up there." She nodded. He nodded. He left. Alara stood at the counter for a moment after the bell stopped moving, and she thought, Thursday. He was leaving Thursday. She had, at most, 2 days before her father would have to answer to Harlan Cole. She did not know why she was tracking these 2 facts at the same time. She put the pen back in her hand and returned to the ledger. Months. That evening, Harlan Cole came to the bakery. He didn't come aggressively. That wasn't his way. He came at 6:30, after the shop had technically closed, when Alara was cleaning up for the night. He knocked twice, which she thought was a pointed courtesy, and waited for her to open the door. "Miss Whitlock?" His smile was precise. "Is your father in?" "He's not." She held the door half open with her shoulder. "I can take a message." "I'd rather speak with him directly, if it's all the same." He glanced past her into the bakery, which was lit by 2 oil lamps and smelled of the day's baking. His expression was one of polite appreciation. "This is a fine little establishment." "Thank you. My father will be back later. I'll tell him you came by." "He owes me $40, Miss Whitlock," said pleasantly, as pleasant as a stone dropped into still water. "I know. I'm going to need that addressed by Friday." He tilted his head slightly. "You understand that I'm being quite reasonable. These things can sometimes become complicated if they're left to drift." "I understand." She kept her eyes on his face. "Friday. I have a proposition," he said. The word proposition sat in the air between them. "For resolving the situation in a way that benefits everyone. Your father is aware of the general outline. I thought it would be appropriate to discuss it with you directly. Alara's fingers tightened on the edge of the door. Not visibly. She'd had years of practice at not showing things visibly. What kind of proposition? He told her. Not crudely, not with any threat explicit in the words. He said it the way a businessman might discuss a trade, straightforwardly, with terms and conditions, with the kind of language that made it sound reasonable, even as the content of it made her stomach drop through the floor. She would come to work at the Silver Spur. The debt would be cleared. She would have a room, meals, and a percentage of what she brought in. He said brought in without specifying what she would be bringing. She didn't say anything while he talked. She stood in the half-open door and looked at his precise smile and listened to the sound of her own heartbeat, which had gone very loud inside her head. I'll discuss it with my father, she said when he finished. Of course. He stepped back. Friday, Miss Whitlock. She closed the door. She stood in the empty bakery and looked at her flour-dusted hands and the cooling rack where tomorrow's bread was already shaped and waiting to go in. And she thought, he has already discussed it with my father. That was what her father had not told her last night when he'd looked at her in that particular way with his eyes aimed at her chin. He hadn't said it outright, but it had been in his face. The specific shape of a man who has already traded something he shouldn't have and is trying to decide whether to confess. She sat down on the bench behind the counter. She was very still for a long time. Her father came in at 10. She was still up, sitting at the work table in the back, with the ledger open in front of her, even though she'd stopped looking at it an hour ago. He saw her face and stopped in the kitchen doorway. Harlan Cole came by, she said. Alara, he told me about the arrangement. She kept her voice level. It cost her something. Did you agree to it? Thomas Whitlock had the grace, or maybe just the cowardice, to look ashamed. He crossed to the table and pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, and he rubbed both hands over his face in the gesture she had seen 1,000 times, the one that meant he had gotten himself into something he couldn't get out of. I didn't have a choice, he said. The $40, there are other choices. I could go to the bank. The bank won't loan us anything. You know that. I could go to some of the regular customers. Ask about Alara. He said her name firmly, like a period at the end of a sentence. Cole holds notes on half the businesses in this town. If I don't settle, he'll call in the note on the building. Then we lose the building. He looked at her then. Really looked at her, for the first time in a long time. And she saw something she hadn't expected. Not just shame, but a kind of tired, selfish calculation. He was 53 years old. The bakery was failing. His daughter was young. You'd be provided for, he said. Better than here. She stood up. She stood up slowly, so that she didn't knock the chair back, so that there wasn't any drama in it. She closed the ledger. I'm going to bed, she said. Alara, be reasonable. Good night, Papa. She climbed the stairs to her room, and she closed the door, and she sat on the edge of her cot in the dark. The wind came down off the mountain again, sharp and cold through the cracks in the window frame. She pressed her palms against her knees and thought very clearly, the way you think when you've come to the edge of something. I am not going to go to Harlan Cole's saloon. I would rather be cold and hungry and lost on the mountain than go there. The mountain. She sat in the dark for a while longer, thinking about a big man on a deliberate horse leaving Thursday, with a place up in the mountains somewhere. She thought about how he'd looked at her face when she'd spoken, just noted information, nothing more, and how that had felt different from the way most men looked at her. She did not have a plan. She had the bare shape of something that might become a plan, if she was bold enough and reckless enough to try it. She lay down on the cot without undressing and looked at the dark ceiling and thought about what her mother had told her, once, when Alara was about 7 years old and had been afraid of something she couldn't name. Sometimes the thing that scares you least is the only option left, baby girl. You pick the least scary thing, and you move toward it fast, before your good sense talks you out of it. Her mother had not been a particularly wise woman in the general accounting of things, but she had known something about moving fast. Massa. Wednesday morning, Alara found him at the Mercantile. She had dressed carefully, not nicely, but carefully, which was different. She'd worn her good dress, which was the same as her regular dress, but hadn't been mended in quite as many places. She'd done her hair up properly instead of just pinning it out of her way. She had spent a considerable amount of time on the walk over telling herself that she was being ridiculous and then continuing to walk anyway. He was at the counter talking to Bill Hennessy about rope when she came in. He glanced over when the door opened, and then he looked back at the rope, and then, a full 3 seconds later, he looked back at her again. "Miss Whitlock," said Bill Hennessy, who knew everyone. "Morning." "Morning, Bill." She came to the counter and stood 2 feet to the left of the mountain man, who was now watching her with that same direct information cataloging look. Up close, she could see his eyes clearly for the first time. Dark brown, slightly watchful. The eyes of someone who had learned to pay attention to things most people ignored. "I need to talk to you," she said to him. He didn't look startled, or if he was, he didn't show it. "All right, privately, if that's possible." She glanced at Bill, who was showing absolutely no shame about the fact that he was listening with his entire body. The man settled the rope question with Bill, paid for what he'd chosen, and followed her outside. They stood on the porch of the Mercantile with the October cold coming down off the peaks and Frost Creek going about its Wednesday business around them. "I heard you say you were leaving Thursday," she said. "That's right. I heard you say you have a place up the mountain." She looked at him directly. She had decided, sometime around 3 in the morning, that the only way to do this was to be direct. She didn't have time for anything else. "I need to know if that's a proper homestead, if it's somewhere a person could winter." He studied her. Not a long study, but thorough. "It is. It's not comfortable, but it's substantial." "Are you married?" A pause. "No." "Have you got any people up there, family?" No. She had prepared what she wanted to say. She had spent 2 hours on the walk and the half-hour wait outside the Mercantile composing it in her head. Now, standing in front of him, she found that all the careful language had dissolved, and what was left was just the plain truth. "My father owes a debt to Harlan Cole," she said. $40. Cole wants to settle it by taking me on at the Silver Spur." She watched his face for a reaction. His face didn't give her much. A slight tightening around his eyes, maybe. "I'm not going to do that, but I need somewhere to go by Friday." He didn't say anything immediately. He looked at her for a long moment, and she held herself still and let him look and tried to ignore the part of her brain that was loudly informing her that this was the most insane thing she had ever done. "You're asking to come up to the mountain," he said finally. "I'm asking if there's any arrangement we could make." She hesitated. Then, "I can work? I've been running a bakery since I was 12. I can bake, preserve, manage stores, keep a household. I'm not delicate, and I don't expect to be treated like I am." She paused again. "I know this is strange. I know I'm a stranger, but I need somewhere to go, and you seem like—" She stopped. "Seem like what?" She thought about it honestly. Seem like someone who'd say no plainly if the answer was no. Something moved across his face. Not quite amusement, not quite not amusement either. He looked at the mountains for a moment, at the wall of peaks to the north, already white with early snow at the upper elevations, with an expression she couldn't fully read. "What kind of arrangement," he said, "were you thinking?" She had thought about this too. "A legal one," she said. "I've thought about it. I know what it sounds like, but a legal arrangement would protect both of us. You'd have help with the homestead. I'd have somewhere Cole couldn't reach me." The silence stretched for long enough that a wagon went by on the street, and a dog barked at something down by the livery stable. "I'd need to think on it," he said. "I have until Friday." "I know." He picked up the bundle of rope he'd bought from Bill. "Where can I find you?" "The bakery." She gestured down the street. He nodded. He looked at her one more time, that noting information look, flat and precise. And then he walked toward the livery without saying anything else. Alara stood on the porch of the Mercantile and breathed the cold mountain air and thought, well, that either worked or it didn't. He came to the bakery at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. She heard the deliberate horse outside, and her hands went still in the dough she was working, and she stood very straight and made herself finish the stroke she'd been making before she set the dough aside and wiped her hands on her apron. He came to the back door, which surprised her. She opened it and found him on the back step, hat in his hand for the first time. "Gideon Hale," he said. "Figured we should have names." "Alara Whitlock." She stepped back to let him in. He came into the bakery kitchen and stood with the low ceiling making him seem even larger, looking around at the racks, the crocks, the work table, the banked fire in the oven. His eyes moved the same way they moved everywhere, left to right, methodical. "You run this by yourself?" he asked. "Mostly, since I was 16. He looked at her. "How old are you now?" 19. A beat. Then, "I'm 34. Said plainly, as if this was relevant information she should have. "All right." He turned the hat in his hands once. It was the most uncertain-looking gesture she'd seen from him. "The place up the mountain isn't easy living. I want to be clear about that. I've been alone up there for 4 years, and I've got it how I like it, which means it's practical, not comfortable. You'd have your own sleeping area, but the cabin is one room. It's hard work year-round. I'm gone some days. Trapping lines, timber, trade runs. You'd be on your own." "I grew up in a bakery," she said. "I've been on my own my whole life." He studied her for a moment. "The arrangement you mentioned." "Yes." "Legal." He said the word like he was checking the weight of it. "It's the only kind that would actually help either of us." "I'm not a man who goes back on his word," he said. "If that matters to you." "It matters considerably." He was quiet for a moment. "We'd need the preacher. He's on Main Street. I know him. Tomorrow morning." Alara felt something happen in her chest. Not quite relief. Not quite terror. Something that was made of both. "Tomorrow morning," she agreed. He put his hat back on. He was halfway to the back door when she said, "Mr. Hale." He stopped. "Why?" she asked. It came out smaller than she'd intended. "Why say yes?" He didn't turn all the way around, just enough to look at her over his shoulder. "You talked straight," he said. "Didn't embellish. Didn't beg." A pause. "And you've got bruises on your left wrist that somebody put there, and you didn't mention them once." He went out the door. Alara stood in the middle of her kitchen in the place she had occupied every day of her life for the past 7 years, and she looked at her left wrist where she'd rolled her sleeve down that morning out of habit, and she thought, he noticed. She stood there for a long time after she heard the horse leave. Quiet. She packed that night. She had less than she expected to pack. That was the first surprise. How few things in the bakery actually belonged to her. The equipment was the businesses. The furniture was the buildings. Her clothing fit into a single canvas bag that had been her mother's, along with a small box of items. The sourdough starter in its sealed crock, wrapped twice in cloth to survive the journey. A tin of recipes written in her mother's handwriting. 3 photographs. A small amount of money she had been keeping, very carefully hidden, for 3 years without telling her father. She did not leave a note. She told herself this was because there was nothing to say. But the truth was more than that. The truth was that after Thomas Whitlock had looked at her across the kitchen table with that tired calculation in his eyes and said you'd be provided for, something in her relationship with words and her father had broken in a final way. She did not have a speech for that. She did not have a goodbye. She was out of the bakery before sunrise, before her father was up, moving quietly through the dark with her canvas bag on her shoulder and the sourdough crock held carefully in both hands. The preacher's name was Reverend Mulch, and he was a small, precise man who had married other people at unusual hours before. He asked them both, quietly and without judgment, whether they were doing this of their own free will. Alara said yes. Gideon said yes. 2 of the Reverend's household, his wife and a neighbor who'd been called over as a second witness, signed the certificate. The whole thing took 20 minutes. Afterward, Alara stood on the church steps with the legal certificate in her hand, and Gideon was loading the last of his supplies onto the pack mule he'd acquired, and the sky to the east was just beginning to turn from black to something colder. "Ready?" he asked. She looked at Frost Creek, at Main Street, still dark and quiet, at the bakery with its dark window, at the silver spur 3 doors down, with not a light on yet. "Yes," she said, and she didn't look back. They were 3 miles out of town, climbing a trail that had begun to feel very far from anything she'd ever known, when it occurred to her fully, not as an idea she'd been working toward, but as a physical fact in her body, that she had just married a stranger and was riding into the wilderness on his say-so. She looked at the back of Gideon Hale's canvas coat, at the repaired patch on the right shoulder, at the way he rode with that easy, economical posture, and she thought, I know nothing about this man. His name, his age, that he had a place on the mountain, that he noticed bruises and didn't mention them. That was the entire account. She thought of her mother's voice. You pick the least scary thing and you move toward it fast. She looked back once, not at the town. She didn't look at the town, just at the mountain ahead of them, which was immense and white and completely indifferent to any of the things that had just happened. Then she turned forward, adjusted the crock in her arms, and kept riding. The trail went up. The trail up the mountain did not get easier. Alara had grown up looking at these peaks every day of her life, the way you look at a wall, present, defining, not particularly worth examining. She had never had reason to think about what was actually up there, beyond the general understanding that miners went up and sometimes didn't come back, and that the men who trapped those high elevations were a specific kind of person who had made a specific kind of peace with solitude. She understood now, within the first hour of climbing, that she had drastically underestimated what up there actually meant. The trail, if it could be called that, was more of a suggestion, a place where the trees thinned slightly, where the ground had been disturbed by enough passing hooves to leave a faint impression. Gideon navigated it without hesitation, and his horse picked its way up with the same deliberate calm its rider showed, and the pack mule came behind with the stoic resignation of an animal that had done this route enough times to find it boring. Alara's horse, a stocky gray mare that Gideon had procured from somewhere, and which he'd told her was reliable without elaborating further, followed the others with its ears flicking in every direction. The sourdough crock sat across her lap, wrapped in cloth, cradled in one arm. She was aware that this was not the most practical way to carry it on horseback. She was also aware that she was not willing to put it in a saddlebag where it might get jostled wrong or cracked against something. The starter was 3 years old. It had survived more than a rough trail. They rode mostly in silence. Not uncomfortable silence exactly, but the silence of two people who had not yet figured out what the appropriate conversational distance was between them. Alara asked, around the second hour, how far the cabin was. 7 miles from town, as the crow flies, Gideon said. Longer on the trail. We'll be there before dark if the weather holds. She looked at the sky, which was the pale gray of old dishwater. Does it look like the weather will hold? He looked up briefly. No. This proved accurate. By the third hour, snow had started. Not the gentle first snow kind, but a mean, driven sort that came sideways off the upper peaks and found every gap in her coat with impressive thoroughness. The temperature dropped fast enough that she could feel the change in each breath. The horses pushed on without commentary. You all right? Gideon called back, not turning fully around. Fine, she said, which was mostly true. He slowed until his horse was alongside hers. He looked at her hands on the reins, at the crock in her arm, at her coat. Then he reached behind him and produced a heavy wool blanket from somewhere in his pack, rolled it once, and held it out. She looked at it. Take it, he said. I'm not cold. This was probably not entirely true, but she took it. She settled it around her shoulders one-handed, keeping the crock tucked against her side, and the immediate difference was significant enough that she said, "Thank you," with more genuine feeling than she'd intended to put in it. He moved back ahead. They kept climbing. The cabin appeared through the snow when she had almost stopped expecting to find anything at all. Had started to wonder, in the cold, exhausted, half-serious way, whether she was simply following a stranger into the wilderness with no destination. Then the trees broke, and there it was. A low, substantial structure of dark logs, chinked tight, with a roof that extended out over a covered porch area and a stone chimney at the near end. Beyond it, she could see the rough shapes of what looked like a smaller outbuilding, and beyond that, a corral with split-rail fencing. It was not beautiful. It was not meant to be. But it was solid in a way that the bakery building back in Frost Creek, which shook in a hard wind, had never been. It looked like something built by someone who expected it to last. She followed Gideon to the corral, dismounted, and stood for a moment with her legs adjusting to being on the ground again. The snow was coming harder now, and the wind had picked up, and she was very, very cold. "Can you get the gate?" he asked, already unsaddling. She got the gate. They worked the horses and the mule in near silence. He handled the unsaddling, and she did what he indicated without needing to be asked twice. She found she was good at reading what he needed from context, which was a skill she had developed out of necessity with her father, but which felt different here, applied to someone who was not looking for a target for his mood. Inside, the cabin was a single room, as he'd said. The floor was rough board, swept clean. One side held a fieldstone fireplace with a proper hearth and a wood stove beside it for cooking. There was a table and 2 chairs, a set of shelves lined with jars and equipment, and a sleeping area at the far end, separated by a curtain hung from a ceiling beam. A second sleeping area, a narrow cot against the near wall, had been made up recently. She could see fresh bedding on it, which meant he had planned for this, which meant that he had made up his mind before he came to the bakery yesterday. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at all of it while Gideon coaxed the fire up from banked coals, and she thought, "This is where I live now." Not with dread exactly. It was more complicated than dread. There was dread in it, but there was also something else. A strange, tentative feeling like the first moment you step out of a burning building. The cold outside is shocking and real and uncomfortable, but at least the building is behind you. "I'll get the stove going," Gideon said. "Should warm up in here within the hour." "I can do the stove," she said. "Show me how you've got it set up and I'll manage it." He looked at her for a moment, then he showed her. That was how the first evening passed. Him showing her how things worked, and her watching with the focused attention she had always given to practical information, and neither of them saying more than was necessary. Where the fuel stack was, how the wood stove drafts ran, where the water barrel sat, and that it would need to be repacked with snow if they ran low. What was in which shelf, and why things were organized that specific way. "You've got a system," she observed, looking at the shelves. "I know where things are in the dark," he said. "Don't move things without telling me first." "I won't," she paused. "I have systems, too. I'll tell you what they are." He nodded. This seemed to satisfy both of them. She made supper from what was available. Salt pork, dried beans that had been soaking in a pot since before he'd left for town, and cornbread mixed in the skillet, which was not her best work, but was hot and substantial. She put the sourdough crock on the shelf above the stove where it would stay warm. They ate at the table. The fire had gotten the room up to something approaching tolerable, and the snow outside hit the window glass in sheets. "The starter," he said, glancing at the crock on the shelf. "My sourdough. I've had it going 3 years." She considered how to explain it. "It's a culture. Wild yeast. You feed it, and it makes the bread rise. Takes longer than using a leavening agent, but the bread keeps better, and the flavor—" She stopped. "Sorry, probably more than you needed." "No." He looked at the crock. "I haven't had good bread in a long time." There was something plain and unguarded in how he said it. Not wistful, exactly. Just accurate, the way everything he said seemed to be just exactly accurate. No dressing on it. "You'll have it again," she said, "once we're settled." He looked at her across the table. The fire threw uneven light across the planes of his face, and she noticed, not for the first time, that he had a scar running through the left side of his jaw, thin and old, the kind that had faded to near invisible with years. She wondered about it and did not ask. "There are things you need to know," he said, "about how the winter runs up here." "Tell me." And he did. He talked with the focused directness of someone who had assembled this knowledge at real cost and wanted to transmit it efficiently. The blizzards came without much warning after November, sometimes lasting 3 or 4 days. The drifts against the north wall of the cabin could reach the roofline. He had laid in stores for 1 person for a full winter. With 2, they would need to be careful. He ran trap lines on 3 separate routes, which took him out of the cabin for 2-day stretches sometimes. He knew the signs that a storm was coming. The specific way the clouds stacked on the north peaks, the behavior of the birds, and he expected her to learn them quickly because on the days he was gone, her reading of the weather was all she had. She listened. She asked 2 clarifying questions and did not ask any others. When he finished, there was a pause in which the wind outside changed pitch, dropping and then lifting again, a long wavering note against the chimney. "I'm not soft," she said. Not defensively, just wanted it on the record. "I can see that," he said. "I won't know things I don't know, but I learn fast." "I figured that too." She nodded. She picked up the plates and carried them to the wash basin. "One more thing," he said from the table. She turned. "The curtain down the middle," he said. "The cot by the door is yours. That's permanent, not temporary. I'm not—" He stopped. Started again. This is an arrangement. I want that to be clear. It's clear, she said. It was clear when I proposed it. He looked slightly relieved, or what passed for relieved in his particular range of expression, which was subtle. Good, he said. Then we understand each other. They understood each other. She went to sleep that night on the narrow cot with the curtain between them and the blizzard making the cabin creak and settle. And she pulled the blanket up to her chin and lay very still in the dark, listening to the sounds of an unfamiliar place and trying to match them to categories. Wind, wood, fire, snow. And she thought, I am 19 years old, and I am married to a man I met 4 days ago, and I am on a mountain in a blizzard, and Harlan Cole cannot find me here. She lay with all of that arranged in her mind, and eventually, without intending to, she slept. Deeply, for the first time in weeks. She did not burn their bread that night because there was no sound of boots on porch steps that her body needed to brace against. The blizzard ran for 3 full days. This was the kind of storm that did not particularly care about human inconvenience. It came down off the high peaks and buried the trail and the corral fence and the woodpile in stages, filling in each cleared space with the methodical persistence of something that had been doing this for 10,000 years and had no interest in stopping. On the first morning, Alara woke to find 8 inches of new snow against the cabin door, and Gideon already up, already dressed, moving to deal with it without any particular alarm. Does it always do this? She asked, looking out the small window at a world gone entirely white. It does this, he confirmed, pulling on his heavy coat. She dressed and followed him outside to help, which he seemed to accept without comment. They dug out the door, cleared a path to the woodpile, and broke the ice on the water barrel. It was hard, cold work, and she did it alongside him without complaint. And when they came back inside, she went directly to the wood stove and put water on for coffee, and made herself useful because standing still in an unfamiliar place with nothing to do was not something she was equipped to handle. On the second day, when going outside was not practical except for the animals, she found herself confined to the single room with a man she barely knew, with no customers to serve and no ledger to update and no bread waiting to be shaped. She cleaned everything that could be cleaned. She inventoried the shelves carefully and wrote the inventory in a small notebook she found in her bag. She repaired a split in the seam of her coat with thread and needle from a kit on the shelf. Gideon read. He had a small stack of books, 3, she counted, and he went through them with unhurried attention, sitting close to the fire. And he did not seem to need conversation the way some people needed it, like a constant low-level noise to prove they were still present. She found she did not either. They were quiet together with a kind of ease that she had not anticipated and did not entirely know what to do with. On the afternoon of the second day, the silence broke naturally. She was checking on the sourdough starter. It had survived the journey and the temperature change and was beginning to show signs of recovery, small bubbles working up through the surface, when he looked over from his book. How do you know if it's ready? He asked. It floats. She turned the crock slightly, examining the consistency. You put a bit in water, and if it floats, it's active enough to leaven bread. We're probably 2 more days out. He closed the book on his thumb, keeping his place. Where'd you learn to do all this? My mother, before she died. She set the crock back. She was a decent baker, not creative but solid. The sourdough was hers originally. Well, the technique was. The actual culture I started myself because hers didn't survive after she passed. Too much time between feedings. When did she die? I was 12. He was quiet for a moment. That's young to take over a bakery. I didn't have a choice about the timing. It came out matter of fact, not bitter. She had spent enough time in the territory between those two things to know the difference. My father could make decent bread when he applied himself. He just didn't often apply himself. Another pause. Then, how'd you end up with $40 in debt to Harlan Cole? Wasn't done gradually? Or all at once? All at once, I think. Probably not the first time he'd gambled, but the first time he'd gambled with someone who cared about collecting. She leaned against the shelf. Cole knew what he was doing. You don't take $40 off a man who runs a failing bakery and then offer to settle it the way he offered to settle it unless you meant to from the beginning. Gideon's jaw tightened slightly. Not much, just a small hardening along the muscle. Cole's been doing that kind of thing for years, he said. She looked at him. You know him? Know of him. Came through some of the same territory, years back. He opened his book again, a signal that this particular thread was done. He won't come up this mountain. I know, she said. That's why I'm here. He looked up from the page, and she held his gaze for a moment, and she thought she saw something move in his expression. Not quite warmth, not warm enough to call that, but acknowledgement of some kind. Recognition. Like two people who have both survived a specific kind of difficulty finding out they have that in common. On the third day of the storm, she burned her hand. She was working at the wood stove, moving a pan that was hotter than she'd expected, and the burn came across 3 fingers of her right hand fast and mean, the kind that doesn't fully register until a second after it happens, and then registers very completely. She pulled her hand back and said a word she would not have said in front of customers, and stood at the stove pressing her burned fingers against the cold metal of the water dipper. Gideon was beside her in a very short amount of time. He took her hand, without asking, just took it, and turned it to the light, and looked at the burn the way he looked at everything, methodically and without drama. Cold water, he said. Not the snow, too cold. The barrel. I know to put a burn in cold water, she said. Then do it. She did. He went to the shelf and came back with something. A tin of salve, well used, the label mostly worn off. Better than nothing, he said. When she took her hand out of the water, he applied the salve. His hands were large and the work was careful, more careful than she had expected from someone whose hands were built for heavy work. She watched him do it and felt the strange disorientation of being tended to by someone, of having someone notice an injury and respond to it as a matter of course, without weighing whether she deserved the attention. I'm fine, she said. I know, he said. Still burns, though. She looked at the burn, and looked at the salve, and looked at his hands. My father, she said, and then stopped. Gideon waited. My father hit me sometimes, she said. She had not planned to say it. She had not, in fact, said it out loud to anyone in her life, because there had never seemed to be a reason to. It was a fact of her life the way the debt was a fact of her life, and you did not often explain facts to people who had no means of changing them. Not often. When he was drunk and things had gone wrong, it wasn't... She stopped again, finding the territory of this sentence unexpectedly rough. It wasn't the worst thing. There are worse things. But it was regular enough that I knew the sound of his step and adjusted. Gideon was still. He had finished with the salve, and he was still holding her wrist, loosely, not restraining, just the hand still there. The bruise, he said. When I saw you in the bakery. Yes. He let go of her wrist. He put the tin of salve back on the shelf in its exact place. He stood with his back to her for a moment, and she could see his shoulders, and she could tell from the set of them that he was angry. Not at her, and not the loud, explosive kind of angry she had learned to read as danger. A different kind. Turned inward, or turned at something that wasn't in the room. You said you were not going to Cole's place no matter what, he said, to the shelf. Yes, good decision. I thought so. He turned back around. His face had resettled into its habitual expression, that careful, watchful flatness. Your hand will be sore for a few days. Favor it. I will. She paused. Thank you. He nodded and went back to his chair and picked up his book. The blizzard broke on the morning of the 4th day, suddenly and completely, the way these mountain storms sometimes did, as if someone had simply pulled the plug. The sky came out a cold, brilliant blue, and the snow on every surface blazed so white that looking at it directly hurt. The world was completely remade by silence. Alara stood in the doorway of the cabin with her coat on and her burned hand in her pocket, and looked at the mountain in the morning light, and she thought, I have never seen anything like this. The peaks above were blinding white against that hard blue sky. The trees below were loaded with snow, bending dramatically, and every few minutes one of them would shed its load with a sound like a small explosion and spring back upright. The air was sharp enough to make the inside of her nose ache. It was objectively the most beautiful thing she had ever seen in her life. She was not going to say this out loud. Behind her, Gideon was pulling on his boots. Going to check the animals, he said. The trail will be blocked for a couple of days yet. After that, I need to get the trap lines checked. I'll come with you to the animals, she said. Then I want to assess what we have in stores. He came and stood beside her briefly in the doorway, looking out at the same white world. She glanced at his profile, the old scar, the dark beard, the unrevealing expression, and then back at the snow. "It gets worse than this," he said. "January, February. You're warning me. Just telling you. I know." She stepped out into the snow, which came up past her knees, and she pulled her coat tighter and started wading toward the outbuilding. "I'm still here," she said, without looking back. She heard him follow. By the end of that first week, she had assessed the stores and found them more adequate than she'd feared. Gideon had laid in substantial supplies: jerked venison, dried beans, salt pork, cornmeal, dried apples, smoked fish, and several items she was still identifying. He was not a wasteful man. Nothing on those shelves was there by accident. But there were gaps she could see. No eggs, which made sense. Chickens didn't winter well this high without serious infrastructure. Limited variety in the preserved vegetables. And while the grain supply was decent, there was no real system for rationing it. She proposed one. He listened, asked 2 questions, agreed to it. "You're good at this," he said when she had finished laying it out. The weekly allotment, the order of what to use first, the thresholds at which they would need to be more conservative. "Managing something that's about to run out is most of what I've ever done," she said. "It's not a skill I chose." He seemed to consider this. "Might be useful anyway." "It is useful," she said. "I just would have preferred to learn it some other way." He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted slightly, that small, almost movement she was beginning to learn to read. "Me too," he said, which she understood was not about bread rationing. She let it rest there, where he'd put it. She did not press him. He did not press her. They moved around each other in the single room with increasing ease. Not comfort exactly, but something functional that was building toward comfort the way ice thaws. Not all at once, but gradually, starting at the edges. On the 9th day, she made sourdough bread. The starter had recovered fully. She mixed the dough the evening before and let it sit overnight, and in the morning she shaped it and baked it in the covered iron pot she'd found on the shelf, and when it came out it was not perfect because the oven ran a little hot and the crust was thicker on one side than the other, but it was real. The smell of it filled the cabin so completely that it changed the character of the place, made it smell lived in a way that was different from wood smoke and leather and gun oil. Gideon came in from checking the animals and stopped just inside the door. He looked at the bread on the rack. He did not say anything for a moment. "That's sourdough," he said finally. "Yes." He hung his coat. He sat down at the table. She cut him a piece. The crust was thick enough that the knife required some commitment, and put it in front of him with the small tin of honey she'd found at the back of the shelf. He ate it slowly. He looked at the table while he ate, not at her, and she went back to the stove and let him have the silence. When he finished, she heard him set the tin of honey down. "I didn't know I was missing that," he said quietly, to no one in particular. She kept her back to him and tended the fire and did not make anything of it. But she heard it, and she filed it away with all the other small things she was learning about this man she had married in a 20-minute ceremony on a cold Thursday morning. The way he organized his tools by frequency of use, the way he moved more quietly than his size suggested he should, the way he looked at the mountains in the early morning as if checking on something. She realized slowly, learning him the same way she had learned the sourdough starter. Carefully. By observation. Adjusting based on what she found, not what she expected. Outside, the mountain sat enormous and indifferent in its coat of white, and the wind came and went, and another week of winter stacked itself on top of the first. She was still here. The trap lines ran in 3 directions from the cabin, each one a full day's work to check properly. Gideon explained this to Alara on a morning in early November when the snow had compacted enough to travel on, standing at the table with a rough map he'd drawn from memory. Not to scale, not pretty, just accurate, which was more useful than either. "This one," he said, pointing to the eastern route, "runs down through the spruce stands to the creek. Mostly marten, some fox. This one goes up the north ridge, longer. I'm sometimes out overnight on that one." He tapped the 3rd line, the western route, which cut through a series of meadows below the timberline. "This is the closest. 2 miles out, 2 back. If conditions are right, I can do it in a half day." Alara studied the map. "How many sets total?" 43 across all 3 routes. I check each line every 4 to 5 days in normal weather, more often if it's been warm. Why more often in warm weather? Frozen carcass keeps. Thawed one doesn't. He paused. And predators find them faster. She nodded, filing this away with everything else. When you're overnight on the North Ridge, what's the protocol? He looked at her. She had started using the word protocol in their conversations around the second week, when they'd both worked out that what they were building was not a household in the conventional sense, but something more like a system. And systems required clear language about expectations. He had adapted to it without comment. If I'm not back by second morning, he said, there's a problem. You'd need to take the gray mare to the nearest neighbor, Pete Calloway, 11 miles south on the lower trail. He'd know what to do. Does Pete Calloway know you? We've traded. He knows who I am. Does he know about me? A pause. Not yet. This was something that they had not discussed. What the arrangement looked like to the outside world, or the very small outside world available to them at this elevation. Alara had thought about it. She understood that the legal certificate was real, and that it meant something in a practical sense, but the mechanics of what they actually were to each other had not been defined past the physical arrangement of the cabin, and the general understanding that they were each carrying their own weight. He'll need to know something, she said, if I show up on his doorstep saying my husband is overdue. Gideon considered this. I'll stop by his place next time I'm down toward the lower elevation. Tell him I've got a wife up at the cabin. Wife. He said the word without any particular charge on it. She filed that away too. The first time she went with him on the western trapline, she was not invited so much as she simply announced she was coming. He'd been putting on his coat, and she'd been putting on hers, and he'd stopped and looked at her. It's cold out, he said. I know. He looked at her boots, which were not ideal for deep snow. He looked at her coat. He did not argue. He went and got a pair of wool gaiters from a trunk she hadn't opened and put them on the table and said, "Wear these over the boots. It'll help," and then went outside to get the snowshoes. She had never worn snowshoes before. She did not tell him this. She watched him strap his on with the efficiency of long practice, and then she did the same to hers, and she got it wrong on the right foot, and she had to redo it, and by the time she was done, he was 10 feet ahead of her and moving. The first 100 yards were genuinely humiliating. Snowshoes required a specific wide-legged gait that was nothing like walking and everything like something she'd have to practice before it felt natural. She caught a front edge on her third stride and went down hard into the snow, both hands plunging in up to her elbows. She got up without saying anything. She adjusted the gait and kept moving. He had stopped. He was watching her. The trick, he said, is to not pick your feet up too high. More of a shuffle than a step. I see that now, she said. He didn't comment on the fall. He turned and kept going. By the end of the first mile, she had figured out the basic mechanics, though her thighs were burning in a way that suggested tomorrow was going to be unpleasant. She watched how he moved and tried to match the rhythm. That energy-conserving shuffle, steady and unhurried, reading the snow surface for soft spots before committing weight. The trapline itself was not what she'd expected. She had a general idea from her life in Frost Creek that trapping involved setting devices in the wilderness and coming back to find animals in them. And this was technically accurate, but told her nothing useful about what it actually looked like. What it looked like was Gideon moving through the spruce trees with the quiet deliberateness of someone who knew every inch of this terrain, checking each set with gloved hands, reading the tracks and disturbance in the snow around it, resetting or adjusting based on what he found. 2 of the sets had caught Martin. Small, dark-furred animals that he handled quickly and efficiently, resetting the traps with practiced economy. He said very little while he worked, but she could see the logic in each decision he made, the way he read the sign around each site, the way she read a ledger. "Can you show me how to reset this one?" she asked at the 4th set. He glanced at her. "You don't need to do the trap line." "I know I don't need to. I want to understand it." He thought about this for a moment. Then he stepped back and talked her through it while she did it. The angle, the trigger pressure, the placement relative to the track. She got it on the 2nd attempt. He checked her work without comment, made one small adjustment, nodded. "That'll hold," he said. She stood up and brushed the snow off her knees and felt the particular satisfaction of having learned a new thing correctly. It was a feeling she'd always liked. It was one of the few things about the bakery she had genuinely liked. The problem-solving of it. The way good bread required you to read conditions and adjust rather than just follow a formula mechanically. The walk back was harder than the walk out. Her legs were done. She managed to maintain the pace he set, but it cost her. And by the time the cabin appeared through the trees, she was running almost entirely on stubbornness. Inside, she pulled off the gaiters and her boots and sat down at the table and didn't move for a moment. Gideon had put water on for coffee before she'd gotten her coat off. She looked at the back of his head while he tended the stove, and she thought, he noticed I needed something hot without being asked. She put this with the other things she'd noticed. November deepened. The days shortened until darkness came before 5 o'clock, and the cold settled in with the permanent quality of something that had moved in for the season and was not interested in leaving. They fell into a rhythm. Not comfortable exactly, not yet, but functional and increasingly efficient. She managed the cabin stores and the bread and the preservation of the hides he brought in. He managed the trap lines and the wood supply and the structural maintenance of the cabin, the ongoing small repairs that a place in the mountains required constantly. They divided the work without much discussion by a kind of mutual observation, each person gravitating toward the tasks they were better at or more inclined toward, filling in the gaps the other left. She learned things she had never expected to learn. How to stretch and tack a hide for drying. Gideon showed her once, and she practiced on the marten from the western line until she had the tension right. How to read the sky for incoming weather, which turned out to be as much about patterns built over weeks of observation as about any one specific sign. How to bank a fire for maximum efficiency, and how to manage the wood stove drafts to control the temperature for baking without wasting fuel. How to navigate the western trapline alone, which she did for the first time on a clear mid-November morning while Gideon was running the northern route. That was the day she found the elk. She was checking the fifth set on the western line, moving through a section of meadow where the snow was deep and unmarked except for the track of a single deer from the night before, when she heard the sound, a labored, rhythmic sound from the tree line to her east. She stopped and went completely still and turned her head slowly. The elk was in the spruce, a young bull, maybe 2 years old, with the beginning of a rack that had not fully come in. He'd gotten one front leg into a deadfall, a tangle of fallen timber half buried in snow, and he'd been working to get it out long enough that the leg showed injury. He was exhausted. He heard her stillness, or smelled her on the shifting air, and threw his head up and tried to lunge and couldn't. Alara stood in the meadow and thought about what Gideon had told her and what he hadn't told her, and what she was going to have to decide on her own, right now, without any more preparation than she'd had a moment ago. She thought, the rifle. She had the rifle. Gideon had been clear that she carried it on the trap line, every time, no exceptions. She had practiced with it enough to be accurate at close range. The elk was maybe 30 yards away. She also thought, that's a lot of meat. More than the two of them could handle if it spoiled before they processed it. She thought about whether the leg injury was bad enough that the animal couldn't survive. She thought about what Gideon would do. She stood in the meadow for a long, cold moment, and then she made a decision based on what she knew, which was limited, and on what she observed, which was that the animal was exhausted and injured and was going to hurt itself worse fighting the deadfall. She did not have a clean shot from the meadow. She would need to move closer into the trees, which would startle the elk into more frantic movement before she could get the angle right. She moved anyway, slowly, keeping low, using the tree cover where she could. The elk threw himself against the deadfall twice more. The angle came clear at 20 feet. She took the shot, and then took it, and then it was done. She stood in the spruce with the echo of the rifle dying in the cold air and the elk still, and she was breathing harder than she'd expected. Her hands on the rifle were steady, but there was something shaking slightly in her chest. Not distress, not regret, something older and more complicated than either. The recognition of what it meant to take a life for a purpose, which she had understood in the abstract for years, but not in her body until right now. She exhaled. She moved forward. She had a knife. She had watched Gideon field dress a deer 2 weeks ago, step by step, explaining while he worked because she had asked him to. She did not do it perfectly. There were 2 points where she stopped, looked at what she'd done, and had to consciously reason out the next step from memory. But she did it. By the time Gideon came down from the North Ridge that evening, She had the elk field dressed, partially quartered, and the first sections wrapped and moved into the snow outside the cabin where the temperature would keep them. He stood at the edge of the porch and looked at the wrapped meat stacked in the snow. He looked at her, standing in the cabin door with blood on her coat, and the rifle leaned against the wall. "Found an elk in the deadfall on the western meadow," she said. "Leg was injured. I made a judgment call." He came up the steps. He looked at the coat. "You hurt?" "No, just messy." He looked at the stack of meat. He was doing the calculation she'd already done. How much they had, how long it would last properly stored, what it meant for the winter. "You dressed it out there." "Yes. I still have 2 back quarters to bring in tomorrow, too heavy to carry today." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the meat, looking at her. She could not fully read his expression, which was not unusual, but this one had something in it she hadn't seen before. "You did good," he said. Just that. She held the compliment at arm's length for a moment, examining it the way she examined the sourdough starter, checking to make sure it was what it appeared to be. It was. It was a plain statement of assessment, with nothing added, and from Gideon Hale that meant more than a paragraph of praise from anyone else would have. "Thank you," she said. "I'll get the coat cleaned tonight." Inside, she started supper, and he came in and washed up, and neither of them made any more of it. But she noticed that he moved around the cabin that evening with a slightly different quality to his silence, less watchful, maybe, or differently watchful, like he had updated something. The thing about living in a single room with someone was that you learned them in ways that close quarters made unavoidable. You learned what sounds they made when they were asleep, and what sounds they made when they were not. You learned which tasks they approached with energy and which ones they put off. You learned their moods not from their words, because some people used very few words, but from the way they occupied space, the angle of their shoulders when they sat down, the pace of their movements in the morning before the day had decided itself. She learned that Gideon slept lightly and woke easily, that he was always up before her, but only by 30 minutes or so, not the 2-hour margin she'd assumed, that he had a habit of standing at the north-facing window first thing in the morning, looking at the upper peaks, doing some kind of private assessment that took exactly as long as it took, and no less. That he was methodical and patient about almost everything except when equipment failed. A binding that broke or a tool that didn't perform right seemed to locate a deep and specific irritation in him that he managed quietly, but that was visible if you were paying attention. She told him this one evening because she was someone who said things when she noticed them. "You're more patient than most people," she said, "except when equipment fails." He looked up from the harness he was repairing. "What?" "The way you get when something breaks. It's the only time you're short about things." He looked at the harness. "Equipment failing costs you when you can't afford to lose the cost." "I know." She was shaping bread. "I'm not criticizing. I'm just saying I noticed." A long pause. Then, "What do I seem like the rest of the time?" She considered the question carefully because he had asked it plainly and he deserved a plain answer. Like someone who decided a long time ago that being upset about things didn't help anything, so you just solved what could be solved and let the rest go. He put the harness down. He looked at her directly, across the table and the lamp and the bread dough, and his expression was the most open she'd seen it in the 6 weeks she'd been in the cabin. "That's accurate," he said. "It's useful," she said. "It's also lonely, I imagine, if it's all you have." The silence after this was different from the usual silences. Heavier, but not bad heavy. The kind that sits on something real. "Your turn," she said, because it was fair. "Tell me something you've noticed." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "You check the starter every morning before you do anything else. Before coffee, before the fire, before you put your shoes on." She had not realized she did this in a noticeable pattern. "It needs to be checked." "I know, but you do it like—" He paused, choosing words with the deliberateness he applied to everything. "Like it's the first thing you make sure is still alive." She looked at the crock on its shelf, the starter she'd been nursing for 3 years, that she'd carried up the mountain wrapped in cloth across her lap. She thought about what it meant. The thing she'd brought from her old life that was still living, still working, still capable of making something that hadn't existed before. "Maybe it is," she said. He picked up the harness again. She went back to shaping the dough. December arrived with a brutality that made November seem like a trial run. The temperatures dropped to levels she hadn't believed were possible until she was living in them. Cold that was not merely uncomfortable, but genuinely dangerous, that turned the air sharp as broken glass and made the muscles of her face ache when she went outside. She had developed new relationships with warmth. She thought about it, tracked it, planned around it, conserved it with the same attention she gave to the food stores. Cold out here was not an inconvenience. It was an adversary. She made mistakes. Everyone made mistakes. She had always known this in theory. In the bakery, mistakes cost flour and time. On the mountain, they cost differently. She went out to the woodpile one morning without her full gloves, just the thin inner pair, thinking she'd only be a minute, and came back in with the beginning of frost nip on 2 fingers that took an hour by the fire to fully resolve and left them tender for 4 days. Gideon did not lecture her. He saw her come in and saw her hands and said, "Sit by the fire," and got the warm water, and that was all he said about it. "I know," she said, before he could add anything. "I wasn't going to say it. I know you weren't. I'm saying it anyway. I know." He looked at her fingers, turning them in the warm water with the same careful attention he'd given the burn weeks ago. "There's no good mistakes up here," he said. "There's only ones you walk away from and ones you don't." "I walked away from this one." "Yes." He let go of her hands. "So now you know." She did know. And the knowing settled into her in a permanent way, the way real learning settles. Not on top of who you are, but into it, changing the shape of things from the inside. She was becoming someone who understood the mountain's specific math, what it cost to be careless, and what it required to survive. These were not the same lesson, and they did not come from the same source, but they arrived together and she took them both. By the time the solstice came, the shortest day, the darkest evening, she had been on the mountain for 2 months. She made note of the date in her small notebook, the same one where she'd written the store inventory. She didn't write much below the date, just 2 months. And then below that, different person than the one who left. Whether that was true in full, she wasn't sure. She was not a different person. She was the same one. But she was the same one with different materials to work with, different skills, different understandings, different sense of what her own body was capable of. The girl who had frozen in the bakery kitchen at the sound of her father's boots would not freeze now. She knew this, though she couldn't entirely explain how she knew it. That evening, Gideon built the fire up larger than usual, which was his version of acknowledging a date. She made sourdough with dried apple folded into the dough, which came out imperfect. The apple made the crumb too dense in places, but smelled extraordinary. They ate together at the table and the fire threw its uneven light, and outside the mountain was at absolute dark and absolute cold, and inside was warm enough and adequate, and something that was not yet the word home, but was edging toward it from the side. "Longer days start now," Gideon said, looking at the fire. "By how much? At first? Couple of minutes a day. You won't feel it for a while." "But it's happening. It's happening." She looked at the fire, too, at the way it moved, constant and inconstant at the same time, the same fire and always a different fire. She thought about Frost Creek, which felt farther away than miles could account for. She thought about Harlan Cole's precise smile and her father's eyes aimed at her chin, and she noticed that these memories, which had been sharp and close in the first weeks, had begun to recede. Not gone, not forgiven in any easy sense, but behind her, the way terrain falls away when you keep climbing. She was still climbing. "Gideon," she said. "I don't regret it," she said, "in case you were wondering." He was quiet for a moment. The fire moved. "I wasn't wondering," he said, but he said it in a way that meant he had been, a little. And she heard the part he didn't say, which was something like, "Neither do I." She did not push it further than that. She got up and put another log on the fire and checked the starter on its shelf, and outside the mountain winter pressed against the cabin walls with everything it had and held. January was the month the mountain stopped pretending it had any interest in human comfort. The temperature on the worst mornings dropped so far below zero that the air itself seemed to crystallize, to become a substance rather than an absence of substance. The trees cracked in the night. loud, sharp reports like rifle shots that jolted Alara awake the first few times before she learned to categorize them as background noise and sleep through them. The horses in the corral needed checking twice a day, and the water barrel needed breaking open every morning, and the woodpile was shrinking at a rate she watched with careful attention, measuring it against the stores chart she kept in her notebook. Gideon had been right about January. It was a different animal than what had come before. She had learned by now to read his presence in the cabin the way she read weather, through indirect signs, through what was displaced or different, rather than through anything he announced directly. The mornings he was going to be out all day, he was up earlier and moved with a specific quality of preparation. The evenings, after a difficult run on the trap lines, he sat closer to the fire and was more sparing with words than usual, not from mood, but from the particular tiredness of someone who had spent the whole day concentrating on difficult things. She did not try to draw him out on those evenings. She made sure there was food ready and left the rest alone, and she had noticed that he did the same for her, that on the days she was quieter, he did not fill the silence with questions. This was, she had come to understand, a form of consideration, maybe even a form of kindness. It was not the kind she'd grown up expecting, which had mostly been transactional or absent, but it was real. The crisis came on a Wednesday in the second week of January, as crises often did, without warning and at the worst possible time. Gideon had left that morning for the North Ridge, a 2-day run. They had checked the sky together before he left, and the signs had looked acceptable. The clouds on the north peaks were high and loose, not the stacked, dense formation that preceded a serious storm. He had gone, and she had watched him and the horse disappear into the tree line, and she had gone back inside and begun the day's work. By noon, the sky had changed completely. She noticed it when she stepped outside to bring in more wood, a shift in the quality of light, a greenish tone to the clouds building from the northwest that she had not seen before but that her body understood before her mind did. The temperature had dropped sharply in the hours since she'd last been out. The wind, which had been nothing in the morning, was now moving the tops of the spruce trees in a direction that looked wrong. She stood on the porch with an armful of wood and looked at the sky for a long moment. Then she went inside, put the wood down, and consulted the notebook where she had been keeping her weather observations since November. She had written down Gideon's indicators carefully, with dates and the conditions that followed. She flipped through the pages, cross-referencing what she was seeing now. She found 2 entries that matched the green light and the northwest wind and the dropping temperature in quick succession. Both times, what followed had been serious. She made a list, the way she always made lists when she was afraid. Not to manage the fear exactly, but to give it somewhere to go that wasn't just circling. What she had. What she needed to do before the storm hit. What could wait and what couldn't. The horses were first. She got them into the small shelter on the south side of the outbuilding, which took 2 trips back and forth across the yard because the gray mare was being difficult about the wind and did not want to go where Alara wanted her to go. They went back and forth about it for 5 minutes, the mare pulling, Alara holding, both of them stubborn, until Alara got her shoulder behind the animal's neck and simply pushed, which worked primarily because the mare was surprised by it. Then the woodpile. She brought in as much as she could carry in multiple trips, stacking it inside the cabin door until the stack reached the ceiling and she couldn't fit any more without blocking the movement through the room. Then water. She filled every container she had, every pot and barrel and jar, because if the storm was bad enough that she couldn't get outside, she needed water for the animals and herself and the fire. The starter. She moved the crock to the warmest spot in the cabin, wedged between the wood stove and the stone chimney wall, and she fed it extra and covered it tight. If the fire went low enough that the crock froze, the starter was dead. She was not going to let the starter die. The storm hit at 4 in the afternoon, which was already close to dark at this time of year. It hit hard and fast, the way the bad ones did, not building gradually, but arriving all at once, like a door thrown open. The wind went from moving the treetops to shaking the cabin walls in what felt like minutes, and the snow that came with it was not the soft vertical snow of the early season storms, but driven horizontal snow that found the cracks in the walls and the gaps under the door and got into everything. She banked the fire high. She checked the wood stack. She sat at the table in the close, fire-lit cabin and listened to the storm work on the outside of everything and thought about Gideon on the North Ridge. She did not allow herself to think about it in a catastrophizing way. She had learned in the months on the mountain that there was a difference between realistic concern and the spiral that started with concern and ended somewhere she could not afford to go. Gideon knew this mountain. He knew the North Ridge better than she knew the inside of the cabin. He had survived 11 winters up here before she arrived. She set this against the wind noise and held it there. Still, she did not sleep well. The storm ran for 36 hours. When it stopped the same way it had started, suddenly, completely. And she went outside into a world that had been rearranged. The drifts were chest high against the north wall. The corral fence was invisible under snow. The trail that led down toward the lower elevation was gone entirely, the landscape smooth and unfamiliar, every usual landmark either buried or transformed. She dug out. She started with the cabin door, then a path to the outbuilding, then water for the horses. She was working on the path to the woodpile, which had been partially sheltered by the cabin's overhang and was mostly intact, when she heard the horse. She looked up. Gideon came through the tree line on the north side of the clearing. He was moving slowly, the horse picking its way through snow that was belly deep on the animal in places, and he was bent slightly forward over the saddle in a way that did not look like his usual posture. She dropped the shovel and went across the yard, wading through the drifts. He dismounted before she reached him, which told her he was functional, at least. But when he turned and she got close enough to see his face, she saw immediately that something was wrong. He was pale under the weathering, a grayish pale, and his right arm was held in a way that was too careful, tucked close to his body. "What happened?" she said. Horse went down on the ridge, ice under the snow. His voice was steady but had a quality of controlled effort to it that she recognized as someone managing pain. "I went over the side with her. She's all right. I'm mostly all right." "Mostly." "Shoulder." She looked at the arm. "Can you move it?" A pause. "Not much." "Dislocated or broken?" "Don't know." She got his horse into the shelter and got him inside the cabin and got his coat off, which was a production that he was too tired to help with and too stubborn to admit he needed help with. And they met somewhere in the middle that involved her doing most of the work while he directed his own body with the focused deliberateness of someone concentrating hard on not reacting badly to pain. She examined the shoulder as carefully as she could with what she knew, which was not extensive. She had read a medical guide she'd found on his shelf, one of the 3 books he owned, and she knew the basic difference between a dislocation and a break. She pressed along the shoulder joint carefully, watching his face, and his face told her things even when his voice did not. "I think it's dislocated," she said. "The joint feels wrong in a specific way, not like there's pieces." "That's what I thought," he said. "You've had this before?" A pause. "Once." She sat back and looked at him. He was sitting in the chair by the fire with his coat across his lap and his right arm against his body, and his face doing the thing it did when he was moving all expression behind a closed door. She thought about what she knew. She thought about the medical guide and what it said about reduction, which was the clinical word for putting a dislocated joint back where it belonged. She thought about the fact that they were, conservatively, 11 miles from the nearest neighbor, and the trail was under 4 feet of snow. "I need to reset it," she said. "I know. I've never done it." "I know." He looked at her directly. "The book on the shelf. 3rd shelf. It's in there. I read it. In November." She met his eyes. "I need you to tell me when the muscle relaxes. That's the part I won't be able to feel from the outside." He nodded. "It took 3 attempts. The first 2, the muscle wasn't ready and the joint wouldn't seat, and she could tell from the quality of his stillness that these were not small amounts of pain he was managing. She stopped between attempts and let the muscle tire further and talked to him while she waited. About nothing consequential, just her voice, steady and matter-of-fact. And she did this because the medical guide had said that distraction helped the muscle release, and because she needed something to do with her hands besides what she was about to do with them. "Tell me something I don't know about you," she said during the second pause. He looked at her like this was an unexpected conversational direction. "Now?" "Now. It'll help." A long exhale. "I was a school teacher," he said. "Before." She stopped. She looked at his face to see if he was managing pain through humor, but he wasn't. He was serious. "A school teacher. For 3 years, Kansas, before I came west. He shifted slightly, testing the shoulder, then stopped. I was not good at it. Why not? 12 children in a room, and I was supposed to know what each one needed. A pause. I'm better with one thing at a time. She almost smiled. She pressed her attention back to what she was doing, felt the shoulder, felt the subtle change in the quality of the muscle. And on the third attempt, when the joint seated back with a sensation she felt in her own hands that she hoped never to feel again, he made a sound that he immediately controlled, and then the arm was back where it belonged. He sat very still for a moment. All right? She asked. Yes. The word came out with more air in it than his words usually carried. That's... yes. She made a sling from a strip of canvas and rigged it so that the arm was held at the right angle, and she made him drink hot coffee with both hands. She insisted on both hands. She needed to see that the arm was working. And she sat across the table from him while he drank it and said nothing because there was nothing that needed saying. After a while he said, "You didn't panic." No, she agreed. Most people would have. She thought about this. I've been managing things that scared me for a long time, she said. I don't always know what I'm doing, but I keep moving through it. He looked at her across the table, over the coffee cup. Where'd you learn that? Survival, she said. Same place you learned yours. He held her gaze for a moment, and the fire moved between them, and something in the room shifted. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, but in the way that the temperature changes when a front passes through. A small but permanent alteration in the air. The shoulder kept him in the cabin for 8 days. 8 days where he could not do the physical work he normally did, and where she could, and where the balance of the household ran through her hands in a way it had not before. She handled the wood. She managed the animals. She ran the western trapline twice, once alone, once with him trailing behind her in a supervisory capacity that he maintained with visible effort, and that she allowed him because she understood the particular difficulty of watching someone else do the work you were used to doing and not being able to help. She also, on the third day, made the bread. She had been making bread regularly since that first loaf in November. It had become part of the weekly rhythm, 2 loaves on Sundays if the stores allowed, sometimes a smaller batch midweek. But on the third day of his recovery, she made something different. She had found a small amount of dried rosemary in the back of the herb shelf and a crock of rendered bear fat that could substitute for lard, and she folded both into the sourdough along with the last of the dried apple and a small amount of honey from the tin on the shelf. It was not a recipe she knew. She made it up from what she had, the way she had been making up most of her mountain life, from available materials, adjusted for conditions. The bread came out dense and dark-crusted and imperfect in its shape, because the dough had been stiffer than she'd wanted and she'd had to compensate. But the smell of it while it baked was something she had not anticipated. Rosemary and apple and the sourdough's tang all together, filling the cabin with a warmth that was not the warmth of the fire, exactly, but something that overlapped with it. Gideon, who had been sitting by the fire doing what he always did when he had nothing to do, working through the slow interior process of managing his own inactivity, looked up from the fire. He didn't say anything. He just turned his head and looked at the stove and stayed very still for a moment, and she saw something cross his face that he didn't catch in time to put back where he kept things. That's not the usual bread, he said. No. She was checking the doneness with a thin knife. I had the rosemary. It seemed like it might work. It smells like... He stopped. She waited. Like something, he said, which was not a completion of the sentence but was as close as he was going to get. She cut him a piece when it was cooled enough, and she cut herself a piece, and they sat at the table and ate. The flavor was stranger and more interesting than the standard loaf. The rosemary was assertive in a way that required a moment's adjustment, and the apple sweetness came through intermittently, unevenly, because the dried fruit hadn't distributed as evenly as she'd hoped. It was not a perfect bread. It was a real one. He ate 2 pieces. He did not comment further, but he looked at the remaining loaf on the rack when he thought she wasn't watching, with an expression she had seen only once before. That moment in early November when she'd made the first sourdough, and he'd said quietly and to no one, I didn't know I was missing that. She thought about what he'd been missing, and it was not, she understood, only bread. It was the thing bread meant, the specific argument that a loaf of bread made about a place, which was that someone had decided the place was worth the investment of time and care and fuel and attention. A trap line kept a person alive. Bread meant something else. Bread meant someone had looked at the space around them and thought, this is somewhere. He had been surviving this mountain for 4 years. He had been surviving it very competently, very alone. The cabin was practical and organized and efficient, and had been exactly what one person needed to keep living and nothing more. She had been adding to it in small ways since the beginning. The bread, yes, but also the way she'd organized the kitchen shelf so that the most used things were accessible without moving anything. The dried herbs hanging from the rafter beam she'd installed herself from a hook. She'd asked him to help her put in the ceiling, the small things that accumulated without announcement and changed the character of a space. On the 6th day of his recovery, he said something that she was not prepared for. She was at the stove and he was at the table with a piece of harness leather he could manage one-handed, working a repair slowly, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind that had become their normal register. When he said, "I've been thinking about the spring," she turned slightly. "What about it?" "There's timber on the eastern slope I haven't done anything with." He was looking at the leather, not at her. "It's good timber. Ponderosa. There's been interest from the mill in the lower valley. I've talked to them before, never followed through." "Why not?" "It's a 2-person operation to log it right." He paused. "At minimum." She turned all the way around. She looked at him at the table, working the harness with his one good hand and his patient deliberateness, not looking at her. "You're talking about next season," she said. "I'm talking about what's possible." She turned this over carefully. He was not asking her anything directly. She understood that. Direct requests were not his natural mode. He was putting information out and leaving her to respond to it or not, which was, she had come to understand, how he said most of the things he considered important. "Tell me about the timber," she said. He told her. He told her about the Ponderosa stand, about the grades of lumber the mill was paying for, about how the logging itself would work, about the money it could generate, and what that money could translate to in terms of the homestead's sustainability. He talked about it with the same focused precision he applied to everything. And she listened and asked questions, and he answered them, and she asked more. And they were both still at the table an hour later with the stove gone low, and the conversation having moved through lumber into a territory that was harder to name, but that was clearly about more than timber. "You're thinking about expanding," she said. "I'm thinking about what makes sense to build," he said carefully. "Toward what?" He looked at her directly then. His expression had the particular quality of someone who has decided to say something and is committed to saying it exactly as it is, without softening or dressing. "Something worth coming back to," he said, consistently, every time. She held his gaze. Outside, the January wind moved through the spruce trees with its low, ongoing sound, and the fire in the hearth was down to coals, and the bread loaf, what was left of it, sat on the rack, and the cabin smelled of rosemary and wood smoke, and the particular compound smell of a place where 2 people had been living in close quarters through difficult months. She thought about what he was saying and what he wasn't saying, and the distance between those 2 things, and how much of her life she had spent managing the distance between what people said and what they meant, and how different it was to be in a room with someone whose gap between those 2 things was small and consistently navigable. "That seems worth working toward," she said. He nodded. That was all. But the conversation had moved something, and they both knew it, and neither of them needed to say that they knew it. His shoulder healed slowly and unevenly, the way bodies healed out here, without professional assistance, without the luxury of real rest, in fits and starts between the demands of living. By the end of the 8th day, he was back on both arms, though the range of motion in the right shoulder was not what it had been, and he was more careful with it, which was its own kind of statement. She noticed he favored it in cold weather, and she noticed that he knew she noticed, and neither of them made an issue of it. February arrived and began its slow giving way to something less brutal. The change was imperceptible at first. Gideon had said 2 minutes of daylight a day, and 2 minutes a day felt like nothing. But over the accumulated weeks, it added up to something she could feel, or thought she could feel, in the quality of the late afternoon light. A slight lengthening at the edges of the day, a suggestion of something on the other side of the cold. She was running the western trapline alone on a Thursday in late February, a clear day, cold but clear, the snow surface firm and navigable. When she stopped at the top of a rise she'd passed 100 times and looked out at the view she usually didn't pause long enough to look at. Below her, the spruce forest fell away toward the lower valley, and beyond that the foothill country opened up, brown and gray and white, and somewhere many miles out and below, there was a smudge on the landscape that might have been the buildings of Frost Creek. She looked at it for a long time, long enough to get cold standing still. She thought about Harlan Cole, whose reach she had placed herself beyond. She thought about her father, who she had not forgiven, and had also stopped spending her energy on, which was the closest thing to resolution she was likely to get. She thought about the bakery with its cracked window and its failing numbers, and the life that had been closing around her like a hand making a fist, and the morning she had walked out of it in the dark with a canvas bag and a sourdough starter and the marriage certificate in her coat pocket. She thought, I am not that person anymore. Not in the sense of erasure. She was still recognizably herself, still the same person who ran numbers in her head, and said things when she noticed them and found the good inside what looked ruined. But the conditions that had constrained that person, that had made her small and frightened and manageable, those conditions were gone. She had walked away from them, and then she had climbed past them, and then she had spent 4 months being tested by things that didn't care at all about her father or Harlan Cole or the particular cruelties of a dying town. The mountain had not made her, but it had confirmed something she hadn't been sure was in her until it was tested. She adjusted her snowshoes and kept moving down the line. That evening, back at the cabin, she sat across the table from Gideon after supper and said, without preamble, I want to talk about the spring properly. The timber, the expansion, what it would take. He put down his coffee cup. He was listening. I want to know what we'd need, she said. Start to finish. Realistic numbers. He pulled a piece of paper from the shelf and a pencil, and they sat at the table with the fire at their backs and began to work the problem. What the timber would yield, what the mill would pay, what they could do with the money, what came first, what could wait. He knew the mountain. She knew how to build a plan from numbers and gaps and unknowns, how to find the stable ground in an uncertain accounting. They worked for 2 hours. The paper filled up with figures and corrections and arrows and scratch-outs, which was what real planning looked like. Not clean, not certain, but honest about what was known and what wasn't. At the end of 2 hours, she looked at the paper and said, It's possible. It's possible, he agreed. Not easy. Not guaranteed. Possible with the specific conditions attached. 2 people, consistent work, a spring that cooperated, a mill that held its prices, a dozen things that would need to go right in sequence. She had spent her whole life making possible into actual with insufficient tools and a bad situation. She had never had the tools she had now, and she had never had a partner she could trust to carry weight when she couldn't carry it. And she had never been in a place where the ceiling on what could be built was set by their own reach rather than by someone else's grip. She looked at Gideon across the paper and the scratched figures in the lamplight. Okay, she said, let's do it. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, okay. And the word was simple and plain, the way everything he said was simple and plain, and it meant exactly what it said. And also, under that, it meant something that neither of them had named yet, but that had been building since the first loaf of bread and the careful hands on a burned palm and a dislocated shoulder put back by someone who'd never done it before, and the long evenings by the fire when the silences had learned to carry weight without breaking. Outside, February moved toward March, and the days kept getting longer by their 2 minutes, and the mountain stayed vast and indifferent and beautiful and entirely unchanged by any of this. Inside, things were different than they had been. March came in sideways, the way it always did at elevation. Not a clean arrival, but a negotiation. Warm days traded against cold ones. The snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes only to return overnight. The mountain refusing to commit to anything definitive. But the light was undeniable. It came earlier and stayed later and had a quality that the winter light had lacked. Actual warmth in it. Actual weight. The kind of sun that landed on your face and meant something. Alara noticed it first on a Monday morning when she stepped outside to check on the horses and stood for a moment with her eyes closed and her face turned up and felt the sun on her skin like a hand placed there. She stood like that for longer than was practical, with things waiting to be done and the day already started. She stood there anyway. When she came back inside, Gideon looked at her from the table. Snow's pulling back on the eastern slope, he said. He had been out earlier before she was up, the way he always was. Another 2 weeks. The access trail to the timber stand should be clear enough to work. She poured coffee and sat across from him and looked at the scratched-up planning paper that had lived on the corner of the table since February, weighted down by a coffee cup to keep it from curling. Then we have 2 weeks to finish preparing. We do. She had spent the tail end of winter corresponding, as best she could, with the Valley Mill. Gideon had made one supply run in late February, the first time she'd been alone at the cabin overnight since his shoulder recovery, and had come back with a written response from the mill owner, a man named Aldous Frick, who had expressed interest in Ponderosa at a price per board foot that made the planning paper's numbers hold up. He had also come back with flour, coffee, salt, 2 new trap stakes, a small bottle of ink, and she had found this at the bottom of the supply pack without explanation. A folded piece of blue wool fabric, 2 yards of it, the kind that could be made into a coat. She had held the wool and looked at it and then looked at him, and he had been very occupied with unpacking the other supplies. "What's this for?" she'd asked. "Thought you might need it," he'd said to the flour sack. "Your coat's worn through on the left side." She had put the wool on the shelf and not mentioned it again. But she had noticed it every day since, and she understood that it was the closest thing to a declaration that she was likely to get from him, and she found that this was enough. The first day on the timber stand was harder than she had expected, which was itself a thing she should have expected by now and kept not being prepared for. The mountain had a consistent habit of being more than her previous experience predicted, and she kept meeting it with her calculations slightly short, not dangerously short, just short. Felling timber required a coordination she and Gideon had to work out in practice. Not in theory, which meant the first 2 trees took most of the morning and produced a substantial amount of arguing that was not quite arguing. They were both too controlled for actual argument, but was a sustained and pointed exchange of perspectives on technique that ended with a compromise they'd both arrived at independently and which worked better than either individual approach. "You were right about the angle," she said, after the 3rd tree came down clean. "You were right about waiting for the wind," he said. They stood in the spruce-scented air with sawdust on both of them and looked at the fallen timber, and she thought, this is what it looks like to build something. Not the finished thing. The building itself. The imperfect, effortful, unglamorous work of turning what exists into what could exist. It took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of hauling timber down the slope to the staging area, of the animals working harder than they'd worked all winter, of evenings where both of them were too tired for conversation and ate in the good silence of people who had used themselves up on something worthwhile. The shoulder gave Gideon trouble in the 2nd week, the cold mornings and the heavy work bringing back a stiffness she could see in his face, and she managed the heavier lifting on those days without remarking on it, and he let her without remarking on it, and this was, she had come to understand, one of the primary languages they had developed, the language of allowing each other things without making it into a moment. The first timber sale closed on a Wednesday morning in late April. Aldous Frick came up the lower trail himself to inspect the grade and oversee the loading, which Alara had not expected. She had assumed he'd send someone. He was a compact, precise man in his 50s with the kind of face that did its calculations openly, and he walked the timber stack with his hands behind his back and his eyes moving over the wood with professional assessment. She stood back and let Gideon handle the transaction, which was right. This was his territory, his established relationship. But she watched Frick closely and read his body language the way she'd read customers at the bakery counter, and she could see before the number was spoken that they were going to be pleased with it. The number, when Frick said it, was better than the planning paper's projection by 12%. Gideon's face didn't change, but she knew him well enough now to see the thing that moved behind his eyes. "We can work with that," he said, which she understood to mean, "that changes what's possible." On the walk back up to the cabin, she did the recalculation in her head. By the time they reached the porch, she had a revised version of the spring plan that was considerably less conservative than the original. "The access trail," she said, stopping at the steps. He stopped too. "What about it? If we improve it, grade it properly, clear the switchback section, the mill could get a wagon up here. We wouldn't have to haul to the staging area. That saves us 2 days of work per load and reduces what we need from the animals." He looked at the trail. He was doing his own calculation. "That's a week of grading work. That pays back in the 3rd load." He turned this over for a moment, looking at the trail with the particular focused look he gave to problems he was finding worth solving. Then he said, "I know someone who does trail work. He's fair. Then we hire him." A pause. He looked at her. "You've changed how you think about this place," he said. "The money, you mean. The scope. He was choosing words carefully, the way he always did when he was moving towards something that mattered. When you got here, you were managing survival. Now you're building. She thought about this. About the long slide from the bakery's failing ledger to this. A conversation on a mountain porch about hiring trail workers and third loads of timber and the math of investment. About how the mental shift had happened so gradually she couldn't point to the day it had changed. Maybe the elk in the deadfall. Maybe the shoulder. Maybe the bread with rosemary that had made him say something the way you say something when what you mean is everything. You started thinking about building before I did, she said. You just needed someone to build with. He was quiet. Then, yes, he said. Just that. They went inside and she made supper and he sat at the table and they talked through the revised plan. Not the careful, tentative version from February, but a real one that assumed continued work and continued timber sales and the trail improvement and a second season that extended what the first had established. She wrote figures while she talked, and he corrected the ones he knew better and added the ones she didn't have, and by the time they were done eating, the paper had barely any white space left. She looked at the full page and felt something she did not immediately have a name for. Not pride exactly, not satisfaction, though there was satisfaction in it. Something more like recognition. The feeling of looking at your own work and understanding that it is genuinely yours, that you made the choices that produced it, and that no one handed it to you, and no one can take it in the same way things that are handed to you can be taken. May brought the first real warmth, and with it, the valley. The first time she went down to the lower elevation since October, she was not prepared for how strange it felt. Not bad strange, just strange. The specific disorientation of returning to a scale of civilization that had stopped feeling like her reference point. She and Gideon went down together, the first trip of the season, for resupply and to sort out the arrangements around the trail improvement. They rode into the nearest sizable town, not Frost Creek, a different direction entirely, a trading settlement called Harwick's Crossing that was larger and less intimate. And she walked down the main street with the odd feeling of someone who has been gone longer than the calendar says. People looked at her the way people in small settlements looked at strangers. Then they looked at Gideon, who was known here from years of trade runs, and they looked back at her with a recalibrated interest. At the trading post, a woman named Clara Briggs, who ran the dry goods counter, looked at Alara's list and then at Alara and said, "You're up at Hale's place?" "I am," Alara said. "Didn't know he'd taken a wife." It's been some months now. Clara Briggs had the directness of someone who had been in commerce long enough to skip social preamble. "That you're doing? The timber deal with Frick?" "That was both of ours." The woman looked at her steadily for a moment. Frick said whoever had organized the grading plan knew what they were doing. He thought it was Hale. "Hale knew the timber," Alara said. "I knew the numbers." Clara Briggs looked at her a moment longer. Then she went back to the list and began pulling items, and she said, conversationally, to the shelves, "There's a woman 2 valleys over trying to expand a cattle operation. Been looking for someone who knows how to run books and manage stores. Can't find anyone worth keeping." She paused, reaching for a bolt of something on the upper shelf. "I might mention your name, if you're open to it." Alara set her hands flat on the counter in the old reflex, the gesture she'd had since the bakery days. "What kind of arrangement?" "Consulting, I'd imagine. Not full-time." Clara put the item on the counter. "There's not much up at this elevation that a capable person can't manage from a distance." Alara went back to the horses with this in her head. Gideon was loading the pack animal, and she came and took the other side of the load without being asked, and they worked the lashings together in the practiced way they had developed over months of doing this. "Clara Briggs mentioned a consulting possibility," she said. "Briggs talks to everyone," he said. Not dismissively, just accurately. "It might be worth considering." She pulled the strap tight and checked the load. "If there's consulting work available, it changes the math on the off-season, the months the trap lines are down and the timber isn't running." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the pack load. "Is that something you want?" She considered the question honestly, which was what he always deserved and what she'd learned to give. "I want the homestead to work," she said. "I want it to work well enough that we're not running on the edge every winter. If consulting work is part of how that happens, then yes." He looked at her. "I mean the work itself, not the outcome." He paused. "You're good at building things from numbers. You've been doing it since you were 12 to keep someone else's operation afloat. Another pause. Might be different, doing it for something that's yours. She looked at him across the horse, in the spring sunshine of the trading post yard, with Harwick's Crossing going about its business around them, and the mountains visible on every horizon. Yes, she said. I'd like that. He nodded. He went back to the lashing. She went back to hers. And the conversation was done in the way their important conversations were always done. Briefly, plainly, with the real content settled and no need to perform anything around it. The consulting arrangement with the cattle operation came through in June. It was modest. 2 visits a season, correspondence between, a straightforward fee for the books review, and stores management she could do with her eyes closed. But it established something, that her knowledge had value outside the cabin, that the skills she'd spent her life developing for someone else's survival were now working for her own. Frost Creek came up once that summer. It had to, eventually. They had ridden to a land registry office in the county seat, a full day's ride, to file the documentation on the timber rights, which required them to establish clearly who owned what and to what extent their operation was a legal, recorded entity. The clerk at the registry was a young man with ink-stained fingers who went through the paperwork with the careful attention of someone who took his job seriously. He looked up at one point and said, "Whitlock, that's a Frost Creek name, isn't it?" Elara kept her voice neutral. "My father was from there." The clerk went back to the paperwork. "That settlement's had a rough year. Heard the Silver Spur burned down in March. Whole block went with it." She felt Gideon become very still beside her, the particular stillness of someone who knows you need a moment and is making space for it. "Anyone hurt?" she asked. "Not badly, from what I heard. The owner, Cole, got out. Lost the building, though. Lost a lot." The clerk turned a page. Half the town was in debt to him, apparently. When the records went up with the building, he shrugged. "Things opened up some, I suppose." She signed where he indicated. Her hand was steady. Outside, in the sun, she stood with her hand on the gray mare's neck and thought about Harlan Cole losing the Silver Spur, and thought about her father somewhere in that town, and thought about the life she had escaped by 48 hours of margin and a stranger's willingness to say yes on a church step on a cold Thursday morning. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel much of anything that had a simple name. There was relief in it. The particular relief of hearing that the thing that threatened you has diminished on its own, that you didn't have to maintain vigilance indefinitely. But there was also the complicated texture of anything involving her father, which she had not resolved and probably would not resolve in any clean way. Because some things didn't resolve, they just became part of the history of who you were. "You all right?" Gideon asked. "Yes." She meant it. "I'm all right." He nodded. He mounted up. She mounted up. They rode back toward the mountain. She wrote her father a letter that fall. She had started it 3 times over the summer and abandoned each attempt because the words had come out either too cold or too conciliatory, neither of which was honest. The honest version was harder. She did not forgive him in a way that required his participation or his acknowledgement. She was not writing to open a relationship. She was writing to close an account that had been left open, which was different. She said, "I am alive and I am well, and I am not coming back to Frost Creek. I hope you have found a way to manage. I am not angry anymore," which is not the same as saying what you did was acceptable. It wasn't. "But I have other things to spend that energy on now." She mailed it at the trading post on a supply run in October. She did not wait for a reply, and she did not tell Gideon she'd sent it, and she did not think about it much after. It was done. The second winter was harder than the first in some ways, and easier in others. Harder because they knew what was coming, and knowledge of hardship is its own kind of weight. Easier because the foundation was different. The stores were better. The cabin had been improved in several small ways over the spring and summer. And the 2 people inhabiting it had stopped being strangers to each other in any meaningful sense. There was an evening in January, so it was 2nd January, the anniversary rough approximation, when the cold outside was exceptional and the fire inside was built up in response, and they were sitting at the table after supper not doing much of anything in particular, and Elara looked across the table at Gideon and thought, with the simple clarity that sometimes comes when you are warm and not afraid, "I know this person. Not completely." She was certain she did not know him completely, and she was fairly certain he was someone who could not be known completely, and she had made her peace with that because she was also someone who could not be known completely, and this seemed like a basis for something rather than an obstacle. He looked up from the harness piece he was working, which was apparently what he did in most of his idle moments. Maintained the tack because the tack always needed it. "What?" he said. "Nothing." She looked back at her own project, which was the second attempt at the rosemary bread, refined from the original. She had worked out the proportion of dried fruit that distributed properly, and the dough hydration that made the crust right. "Just thinking." A pause. "About what?" She considered being evasive and decided against it. "About the fact that this is the best I've lived," she said. "In terms of, not comfort, I mean. Not ease, but best." He was quiet for a moment. The fire settled. Outside, the wind did what the January wind always did, which was press against everything with its full and impersonal weight. "Yes," he said, quietly. Just the one word, and under it the thing he didn't usually say out loud, but that she had stopped needing him to say out loud, because she heard it in the way he stayed, in the way he showed up every morning to do the next difficult thing alongside her, in the way he had put blue wool on a supply list without explaining himself. The bread came out right this time. Not perfect. The left side of the crust was still thicker than the right, which was a drafting issue with the stove that she had not fully solved and might never fully solve. But right. The rosemary and apple and the sourdough's slow tang all in their correct proportions, the crumb open and even, the kind of bread that made the argument she had understood since November of the first year, that this place was somewhere, that someone had decided it was worth the time and care. She cut 2 pieces and put them on the table and sat down. They ate in the good silence. The fire moved. The mountain did what the mountain always did, which was to remain exactly as it was, vast and permanent and completely indifferent to the small, complicated, imperfect life being built within its boundaries. But inside those boundaries, something had taken root. Not in a grand way. Not with the clarity of a story that knows it is a story and wraps itself accordingly. It had happened in the spaces between things, in a burned hand and a dislocated shoulder, in a bread loaf smelled from across a room, in 2 people planning on a piece of paper until all the white space was gone, in 48 hours of desperate calculation and one stranger's willingness to say yes to another stranger's plain, honest ask. Elara Whitlock. Elara Hale. Now, though she'd never made much of the name change, she knew who she was either way, had not been saved. She needed that to be clear in her own accounting. She had saved herself first by moving fast toward the thing that scared her least, by making the ask, by walking out of the bakery before sunrise with a starter and a canvas bag, and the specific courage of someone who has run out of other options and decided that running out of options is not the same as running out of choices. What Gideon had given her was not rescue. It was room. Room to become what she had always been capable of becoming, if the conditions would allow it. She had given him something similar, the difference between surviving a place and having a reason to build one. Neither of them had been looking for this when October had put them in the same small town on the same afternoon. Neither of them was going to claim they had, but they were both, in their different registers of honesty, willing to say it had happened and that they were glad it had. The starter on the shelf above the wood stove bubbled quietly in its crock, as it had done every day for 4 years now. Through 2 winters and a marriage and a dislocated shoulder and a timber stand and a letter that closed an account. Living, patient, requiring only to be fed and kept warm. She would feed it in the morning. There was bread to make and work to do. And a life that was, in the most real and unbeautiful and hard-won sense of the word, hers.